Okay, so that's a non-destructive edit. You see, I can turn that on and off. I could do 16 more operations or 20 more operations and get past what will fit on the history palette and still go back to this layer and turn it on or off. I can also select this tulip and again I'll feather that, shift function key 6, 1 pixel. Get a little more yellow there. And with another adjustment layer, I can select hue, saturation, and brightness and do the same thing I did with that other method, except that now it's non-destructive. And actually with this one, I can select individual color ranges. Like if I want to do just the yellows and make them more yellow or more red or blue, I can do that here. If I want to adjust only the magenta range, actually I don't see any magenta in that. If I shift that, nope, there's not much magenta in the non-edited image or the non-adjusted layer. Let's try reds. I want to make my reds more saturated. Darker, lighter. I can do that here. And unlike the replace color method, I'm doing it non-destructively. I can turn that on and off. I can double click on this and go back to the properties and change the saturation or the lightness or the hue or any segment of colors. So non-destructive edit. I'd like you to do at least one tulip with the color changed as a non-destructive edit. What else can we do? Well, I'd like to increase the contrast. So I'm going to add an adjustment layer for brightness and contrast and brighten this image a little and increase the contrast a little. And I'm looking at that sculpture and thinking, I'd like it to be a sunnier day and have a little more contrast on that. So I'm going to edit that, but I'm going to do it non-destructively. Now, if you've ever done any photographic work with conventional film and photographic paper, you know what this hand means. This is a burn tool. If I was printing a negative onto photographic paper and I wanted to burn in or darken an area, I would hold my hand underneath the beam of light and move it around to focus light in just one area. Or if I wanted to lighten an area, I would use a dodge tool, which is sort of a little black disc on a small wire that you can move in front of areas of the image to lighten it. Well, we have that here, for example, and you can do it in mid-range highlights or shadows. So for instance, the shadows, if I want to dodge those, and I'll do this, I'll exaggerate this for you. You can see that lightening the shadows. That's a destructive edit. So Command Z, I'm going to undo that. Make sure I've got no dodges here. And I got a dodge there, so I'm going to undo that dodge. To do non-destructive dodging and burning, we have to have a dodge and burn layer. I'm going to add another layer here. And I'm going to fill that layer with 50% gray, because if I make it an overlay blending mode at 50% gray, it has no effect on the image except where I do dodging or burning. So shift function key 5. And the last thing I did on the previous exercise was background color, but the default is usually going to pop open as 50% gray because it's really handy for this. So, okay, there's 50% gray. I'm going to turn, actually, I'm going to put this above those so that the color changes aren't affecting my gray. Or I could turn those all off, but I want to see my sculpture in the color that I have corrected it to, and in the contrast range I've corrected it to. So I'm going to change this to overlay, and notice at 50% an overlay has no effect on the image. But if I start dodging and burning on it, and watch the thumbnail here, I'm going to dodge the shadows And right there, I don't know if you can see a little light streak forming. I'm gonna go at 100%, which is like really crazy, but so there I'm dodging and it's getting white in there. And if I burn the shadows, it's getting black in there. Okay, I'm going to shift function key 5 and fill that with 50% gray again. Before I do this, I want to mask for the sculpture because I don't want my burns and dodges to spill onto the background because that will make it look obvious that it was photoshopped. So I'll try a quick select on here. Not totally precise. I think this back here is actually a window and not part of the sculpture. It's a window in the base of the building. So I'm going to just remove that from my selection, holding my Option or Alt key. Deselect that, and I will go around this tulip the same way, a little too far. Or I could use the magic wand tool at a tolerance of 7. That shouldn't get me into too much trouble. That means 7 levels of similarity it will add to the selection. Like right here, I could probably go up to 20 on this and add that knee back in. I seem to have lost the knee. Okay, and again, I'm going to shift function key 6, give it a 1 pixel radius feather, and add a mask to that layer. So now when I dodge and burn, here's a burn in the shadows. Here's a dodge in the highlights. You can see something forming in here, but I have had no effect on the original pixels. I haven't changed any original pixels. Okay, shift function key 5, fill that with gray again because I didn't like that. Perhaps I will more carefully take the dodge tool and the highlights and make my brush smaller. It's at 100%. That's a bad idea. You want to do this at a fairly low percentage because you can always dodge it more. I'm just going to add some highlights there, brighten those highlights a little. And maybe I'll dodge the midtones. And maybe I'll just burn some of the shadows some more. Actually, I think midtones, I'd like to burn this a little more because I think I got a little too rambunctious. My highlight there. Okay. So I'd like to see a masked dodge and burn, non-destructive dodge and burn using a 50% gray layer. One more thing we could do, you'll notice that the background is slightly out of focus, which is typical. The camera has a limited depth of field depending on what the aperture setting is on the camera. Wider aperture, less depth of field, smaller aperture, greater depth of field. This is a somewhat overcast day, so it's probably shot a little bit on the open side. If I wanted to give the illusion that it was a sharper photograph, I could select the sculpture and command click on that, select the sculpture and add the foreground. I'm going to use the polygonal lasso tool, hold the Option key to subtract, Option or Alt key, and subtract this part here, which is all straight lines. I just need to get this one tulip in there. Okay, that's my foreground. Shift function key 6, 1 pixel feather. Command Shift I, invert the selection. And this back here, I could filter, convert for smart filters, filter blur, Gaussian blur, because a Gaussian blur allows me to control just how much I'm blurring something by very small increments. So I'm going to just blur this, let's say 1.8 pixels. And that gives the illusion that the foreground is actually in sharper focus because it's relative to the background. How else can I make the foreground seem sharper? I can go back to the smart object before I added the Gaussian blur. Command Shift I, invert the selection, filter, sharpen, smart sharpen. That looks a lot crisper. As a matter of fact, it looks too crisp. I might try like 75%. Turn the preview on and off. Okay. If I reduce the radius, 100% at a radius of 1 pixel, perhaps, or 75% at a radius of 2 pixels. Reduce noise so I don't develop artifacts that make the picture look strange or artificial. And that's removing Gaussian blur, or I could remove lens blur, and that works pretty good too. So it's fairly subtle, but if I turn this on and off, you can tell that the foreground has been made sharper. If you have an image where you have a distinct foreground, midground, and background, you could isolate those with masks and then do selective sharpening or blurring to make it appear that the focus, the point of focus of the camera has shifted to the foreground or the midground or the background, depending on which one you bring into sharper focus. So that's all I need you to do on this one. Is you can play around with smart filters on the sharpness or blurring the background. You can dodge and burn the sculpture using a non-destructive dodge and burn layer. That's fill the layer with 50% gray, mask the thing that you want to dodge and burn, and use dodge and burn tools on that gray layer as an overlay blending mode, because an overlay at 50% has no effect on the image. But when you darken or lighten anything in that area, it does affect the image. I'm just going to go back to my curves again, and I think I might be just a little bit too bright here. If I just bend those a little bit, I might improve my contrast a little. And let's see. That's okay. I'm going to go to my history palette. See, before I change the curve, after I change the curve. Before, after, and I think I like that. So at this point, I would Command Shift S, your last name, DL5B, as a PSD file with layers. And that completes DL5B.